Hello, and welcome to the Inside Out podcast. This is your host, Tupa Daud, and I hope all of our listeners are doing well. Today, we'll be delving into a topic that is quite heavy because it's something that you might benefit from or relate to, or someone from your friend or family can relate to. It's heavy because we'll be discussing the emotional and the psychological impact it has on you as a person. What I'm talking about is generational trauma. Generational trauma is quite complex and it's heavy because it involves talking about your past, your personal struggles, and family dynamics, all which have an impact on you as a person today. It's very important to understand if you are affected by generational trauma and if you're carrying those things forward. To understand that, we have Dr. Arya with us, who will help us unpack this complex topic and help us find ways where we can liberate ourselves from this generational trauma. Hello, Dr. Arya. How are you today?
Hi, Cuba. I'm very good. How are you?
I'm good as well. So, what do you feel about this topic?
Well, I think it's an interesting and very important topic, and like you said earlier, it's a very heavy topic. It's a very sensitive topic because you know, even if you don't know it, you probably after this podcast will realize that we are all somehow going through it. And the thing is with generational trauma, like just to define it at first, is also known as ancestral trauma or intergenerational trauma, which basically means that our trauma comes from our ancestors. It's not, a lot of people will say, oh, I got traumatized from this specific event or, like a specific scenario you've been through and so on. But the truth is that trauma can come in many forms. And generational trauma is specific to, I'll go into it in a bit on the different types of traumas, but it's very relatable to all of us because I just had this discussion actually with a friend yesterday, and she was saying, she said something that said, generational trauma. And, we take it as a bit of a joke, but, really it is very, very sensitive and it is very traumatic, it can be. So if we go back to, to the definition of it, we will realize that we're not really much in control of it because it comes from, it's passed down from generation to generation. And that's basically why it's called generational trauma. But the idea of it is that whatever has happened in my parents' generation and their parents' generation and their, grandparents' generation, this is continuously passed down to different generations. So whatever I'm being exposed to, let's say by my parents, I'm also exposing my children to. And, we'll go into detail about that, but just wanted to give the listeners a bit of a brief of what this basically is.
When even I was doing my research about this topic, and the first thing that comes up about generational trauma is the Holocaust survivors. And while that's there, it also showed, like when you look at the research, that not only the Holocaust survivors, but children who were not part of the Holocaust, but their parents and grandparents were part of the Holocaust, they were suffering from PTSD or from looking at their parents. They also had anxiety and depression, although were not exposed to the trauma that they actually go when their parents or their grandparents went through in the Holocaust. But keeping like the war aspect aside, that which is the most common example used, you mentioned about it being in families, parents. So is there a phenomena of parent trauma? Does parenting trauma exist? And if it does, how does it manifest and gets carried on forward?
Yeah, parenting trauma exists absolutely. It's a very recognized phenomenon. But I'll go back to what you said about the Holocaust first, because there is also, of course, the aspect of the parent trauma as well there. So if let's say, now let's just assume in general it's anybody who has been exposed to war or any traumatic like bigger events like earthquakes and so on. Now what happens is as a parent and you have let's say two or three children, by default you're gonna talk about these things. So there is always going to be some sort of bias when you talk about it. So obviously Holocaust survivors or even like any type of war. Now let's say just hypothetically Egypt and Sweden are in war, okay, and Egypt is exposing Sweden to lots of like damage and death and so on. Now, of course, the people who are exposed to this are gonna develop some level of hate and some level of anger and aggression and so on. And that hate is going to be transferred to my children. Now, even though my children, like you said, have not been exposed to it, they have not been in the war themselves, but it is kind of like inherited in a way because it's so rooted so deep in our unconscious. Even if I don't want my children to be racist or I don't want my children to be discriminated to other races, religions, and nationalities, and so on, it's going to happen because in one way or another, we transfer that. And if it's not we'll go back to the genetics later, but if we're talking about the everyday life, like social environmental influences, even if I talk to you like now about, let's say I'm just going to talk about coffee, and I go like, oh, coffee, now automatically you're going to feel like I don't really like coffee, right? So this is really what happens with our children, when they hear these kind of like hints or indications, they're going to develop that sort of like, oh, we don't really like those people. So this is in the context of war and so on, this is how it develops. We develop not just generational trauma, but ultimately like racism, discrimination, and a lot of issues that we have in our society right now.
So it's like our behaviors, our patterns, unconsciously we are transferring that as well to our actions. Like, oh, I don't like this person, and why? There's no reason given, or sometimes if the reason's given, it's very like minute, or it's not that important, or sometimes it's so huge that you yourself be like, yeah, I don't want to be with that person or with that community. But like coming back to like parenting trauma, how do you think it manifests? Like, how does it start? Where does it happen?
Well, this is a good question, because this is one of the things that I always talk about so much with the parents I work with. And the idea is that it happens just really pretty much the same way when we talk about war. So if, for example, I'll give you a very brief example, I think a lot of our listeners can relate to. If my parents use a kind of like, I would say toxic or unhealthy relationship, or unhealthy way of trying to motivate me, which I know, for example, a lot of people can relate to, when our parents go like, oh, you only got a B, I thought you would get more than that. And obviously they do that to help us, but they think this is helpful. And they think, oh, now I'm going to push my child, I'm going to motivate them to become better. But actually, what goes on inside the child's head is like, oh, maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I need to work harder. Maybe I need to do this. So this is a type of trauma you're exposing the child to. And then when that child grows up with this mindset, what happens is that they then become like that. Okay. Then they transfer that type of, parenting approach to their children, because that's how I've been raised. That's how I've been, brought up my whole life. So I believe that this is the right way. So basically, this is a very, very classic standard example of parenting trauma, where you transfer this kind of trauma to your children, to next generation, next generation. And I saw a very interesting post recently on Instagram. It was saying something about, how our generation, as of the moment, is like doing lots of therapy, taking medications for anxiety and here and there. And I remember specifically one comment that one guy had written, and he said, that's because we're trying to break generational trauma. We have been through so much trauma, and we try to just get rid of it. So we have to stop at this point. We have to say, no, I'm not going to be that parent. And I'm not going to put my child through that, because we don't do it. Of course, nobody wants to damage their child, right? Nobody wants to harm their child. But it's because it's been rooted in our childhood. This is what we see as this is parenting. That's how parenting happens.
So when you're talking about this, like what I've seen in many families is like, the grandparent, when he was a father, he would treat, like if the son made a mistake, he would give silent treatment. He would be quite harsh. He wouldn't tell the son what's wrong. But when the son becomes a father, he repeats that exact same pattern with his son or with his child, with the remaining of his relationships. So even though when he was a child, he didn't want his father to behave with him that way. He wanted maybe love. He wanted his father to sit down and explain it to him. But he repeated that exact same pattern with his own child. So how does unresolved parenting trauma from one's own childhood influence their parenting style and decisions?
It's very straightforward. What you see is what you get. You get it, you do it. This is how it works. Because there's a very popular saying that when you raise children, you say, don't tell your child what to do, show them what to do. Okay, because they will. If you tell your child don't smoke and you're smoking, they're gonna smoke because they see you smoke. And that's the same idea. It's all about show them. So if you want to really stop this consistent, transfer generational trauma, you need to really say, okay, this is one of the things that I really want our listeners to focus on today as a kind of technique to how to manage that is look inwards. We named this specific podcast Inside Out, so we can start looking in and we can say what is really going on inside. And if I, for example, start being a bit like you said, I give the silent treatment to my son, but I'm not really happy with that because my dad used to do that. So why am I doing it? So when you start analyzing, you start looking inward, say, why am I doing that? Why is this happening? Even though I'm not happy with however I was raised, but I still do it. And to give a personal example, I see my brother doing that with his kids. My dad used to treat us a certain way, and then he's not happy with that, but he also transfers that, right? And again, that is generational trauma. It's out of our control. It's usually unconscious. But if we are conscious enough, we can actually control it. We can stop it, okay? And we can fix it. We can say, I don't want to do this to my son, or I don't want to do this to my daughter. I need to see really what's going on. So we go inwards. We start analyzing what's happening. Why am I doing it? Where is this coming from? Like you said earlier, where does it start? Probably it's been in loads of generations. It's not just like with my parents, it's been with their parents and my grandparents and so on. That's how it happens, in short. And that's how we stop it. We need to take a break, breathe, say, why am I doing this? What is really happening? I don't like this way of, that I was brought up. Then why am I doing it with my children? That's already a first step to really start your kind of like intervention, I would say, the way we change or we stop generational trauma.
So when you were talking about like looking inwards, there was this one time. So I, at one point of time, like in my so I'm South Asian. So in our South Asian community, we have a lot of taboo when it comes towards speaking about mental health. So whenever you would like ask if someone in my community or my culture would go like, oh, I feel down all the time, or I'm anxious and nervous, they would just be like, be quiet. Or we have this famous saying in Urdu, which I'll translate. It said, log kya kahenge? So what will people say? So if you want to be like, I feel like I should seek out help, they just shun you down. They're like, no, maybe just change your routine or do something different or focus on other aspects of yourself, be more grateful. I mean, those things were there. And I remember at one point in life that I internalized that what will people say quite heavy inside me. And then when situations happened around me, and especially with my friends and close people, and I realized that I don't have answers for certain things, I cannot help you, and maybe seeking help is the best thing for you. So that's when I realized that, yeah, seeking help is fine. Breaking the stigma is very, very important. So besides, like, we unconsciously internalize things and we repeat those patterns even though we don't like it. So you mentioned about like recognizing it, but besides recognize it, if we have recognized it, what other steps can we take, like, to understand that we're carrying our ancestral or parental trauma, and what should we do to change it?
Mm. Well, that's a good question. So if we go back to recognizing or just, identifying, and I always say recurring patterns, because if it just happens like a one time, one off, it might be a situational influence, something that has influenced me in that moment. But if it's something I always do, and this is like my recurrent pattern, this is when I start to look inwards. This is when I start to say, why do I keep doing this? And one thing that we do even in like behavior therapy, for example, is really looking at what triggered that behavior. Okay, so part of recognizing it is recognizing what triggered that behavior. Like what is the antecedent to my behavior, basically. Like let's say if I gave this silent treatment or I acted in a certain way, I did something that I'm not usually happy with. What triggered that? So when we can identify that, we say, okay, then this behavior happened, and as an outcome, this, so and so happened. So the idea here is we see a certain pattern or a certain chain of sequence. And once that has been done, and usually that actually takes a lot of effort and time. It's not as easy as we just discussed it. There is so much effort in breaking a pattern or a habit that you have been used to all your life, not just your adult life, but even your childhood, because this is what you have been exposed to as a child. So if you have such difficulty, it's not unusual. I don't want anybody saying, oh, I tried, but it didn't work. It takes lots of effort. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of awareness. But the idea is that once it's done, once we have figured out why is this happening, we can then start, educating ourselves about it. So if it's pretty much, I'll give you an example of how it is. When sometimes you're sick and you have all these symptoms, but you don't know what it is. So you go on Google and you put in all the symptoms, and then you get usually cancer or some very severe disease. Okay. But even though it's not correct, of course, but you'll get something in the end, right? You'll get like, oh, this could possibly be that or this. So it's the same idea. Educate yourself. What is this? Where is it coming from? Educate yourself, read about it, and then once you have read about it, you are able to kind of understand where is this coming from, where is it stemming from. It's a pattern, for example, that was in your parents. It was like for example, in an environment you were living in. Because also it's not always just related to parents. It can be the environment as well. Like I said earlier, like war zones and so on. Of course, there's going to be continuous hate between certain countries who have been through war, like historically and so on, and they will just hate each other without no actual reason. Like I have not been there myself, but I still hate that person, or I still hate that specific country or so on. So the idea is that once we have identified where is this coming from, we need to keep engaging in self-reflection. Introspection is very important. And then we need to obviously seek out help if this is, something that you really want to fix, like I always say, or to work on. you know, Maybe I, as a person of my own, I'm not strong enough to do that. I'm not, and again, I don't mean strong enough like I'm weak, because I don't want people to believe that there is such, distinctions between strong and weak. But the idea is that sometimes I don't have the strength or the resilience to keep fighting this generational trauma, to keep fighting these rooted, inherited like thoughts and unconscious opinions and so on. So what we need to do is really break through, and the last step would be to seek support, seek help. That could be through your family, your friends. That could be through a therapist. That could come in many, many forms. It doesn't. I'm not with, once you have an issue, go to the therapist. I'm not with that. It can come in many forms, talking to a friend, talking to a family. Now, obviously, when we talk about therapists, that's like a level of, where we need professional support. But just talking, like as of right now, me and you are talking about this, I can already start identifying certain things that happened in my childhood that I really wasn't aware of. So already talking to someone, that can already trigger a lot of self-awareness.
Now even I'm thinking about my childhood as well. But
Yeah.
when we're talking about like generational trauma, but I'm curious about how people come to realize that these patterns that they've inherited from their parents are not necessarily correct or healthy. Because when we look at it, our parents grew up in a completely different time. They had different opportunities and they made their parenting styles work for the circumstances that they faced. So, do you think the challenges or the changes in opportunities, especially in an evolving world, played a role in the way parents behave? Or parents just believe that, we have been taught this way, so this is the only right way, should be continued? So what I'm asking is like, where does the cycle of trauma begin? And with parents being so unaware of the potential harm they are causing to their child.
It's such a good question, because now we're really talking about, since we're talking about generational trauma, we need to talk about generations, obviously. And our generation, like you and me, for example, we have different generations, but as opposed to our parents,
Yeah.
we are much closer than us and our parents. And our parents lived, first of all, in an era or in a time where technology wasn't available. And let's really acknowledge the importance of technology and evolvement and development of the humankind. We have been exposed to countries. We can just open Instagram and go to travel to different countries in a few minutes. Our parents didn't have that. And as they were living in that specific culture or that specific country and traditions and norms and so on, that's all they knew, right? That's what they were exposed to. And it wasn't very common to travel, maybe like say 50, 60 years ago, as it is now. Like it was really a luxury, right? Like those who traveled, it was really like, oh, wow. But for us, it's like, oh, I'm gonna go, I don't know, to Spain on the weekend, just 2, 3 days and come back. It's accessible. Everything is open. The world is open now, travel is open, online cultures, languages, everything is just available, you know? So of course there's going to be a very big difference between this generation and the past generation. And I always say for my generation, this is like we are like the kind of like in between. We experience both, because I also lived my childhood without technology. And I remember like up till I was maybe like 15, 16, there was no technology, and even a bit older. And we had to literally just hang out and socialize, as opposed to when we had technology. Of course socializing become much less, but the idea is that we were exposed much more socially. Okay, so we were we are now, like I know how the tradition in China works. I know how they celebrate New Year. I know what happens in India at this time of the year. We didn't know that as children. So the idea is, what I'm trying to get at is that parents who lived in that specific era or time, they didn't have the benefits and this luxury that we have today. And obviously that's going to impact, because right now, for example, I'll tell you an example of my relatives who have, by coincidence, they're twins and they have babies at the same time, and they are reading every little thing about parenthood. This is how they need to sleep, this is when they need to eat, if they do this, you need to do that. Our parents didn't have that. They didn't have the resources because they didn't have the online benefits. Of course there were books and so on, but again, it's not the same as just clicking your phone and my child is crying because of this, what do I do? It's just available answers at the instantly. So of course they were influenced by their parents and so on, and cultures that really in the end decided their behavior. And they this is why more or less most of them behave the same way. Like if you look at previous generations as well, as opposed to the coming generations, where we break the chain. We say no. I'll give you an example of this. I think a lot of people can relate to this. Like my mom, she used to tell my cousin, "Oh, in our times we never did this. We never put them to sleep early, but you turned out just fine." And I think a lot of people can relate to this, right? And then she said, "Yeah, well, your time was different. You didn't have books, you didn't have resources, you didn't have that, you didn't have this. Now we have this, so we need to use it." So we are kind of breaking this generational trauma in a way, because we are now saying, you know what, I'm not going to follow my parents' footsteps in every way. Maybe the good things, of course, but if I see that something was wrong, I can now identify, I can now recognize. I don't think this is getting a baby to sleep it's 12 at midnight is not the right thing to do, right? So now we know, like, these are not the right things to do, even though maybe at our time we were actually sleeping in those times. And the idea is that, like, biologically, health-wise, mentally, and so on, is wrong for a child that young. So the idea is that we are more educated, we are more exposed, and exposed to different cultures, different languages, nationalities. So we are able to really learn from all that, as opposed to our parents' generations.
So when you're talking about culture, so is there a difference in how parenting trauma manifests in different cultures and communities?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we know even now, regardless of technology or not technology, we know that cultures differ, right? So cultures will decide how you behave, basically. And if I'm speaking from my own experience, being raised in Sweden, for example, I could see a very big difference between how my classmates were raised, for example, as opposed to how I was. So even though I was living in Sweden, I was still being raised with this kind of Egyptian, traditions and cultures and so on. And I'm not saying this is good or this is bad. I'm just saying it was different. And the idea is that even parental trauma, it comes, of course, in many different forms. Sometimes being too lenient can also be an issue, and I have seen that myself with a lot of people. When parents are too lenient, it also comes in the form of some kind of like neglect, or I'm not really interested in what my child is doing. I had a friend in school who was always like, oh, she could go out anytime and she could go here and she could go there. But in the end, that transformed into kind of like neglect from her parents, because they weren't really like looking into her benefit, like, or what's harmful for her and so on. So in the end, this girl, she had a lot of trouble raising her kid as well, because then when she got a baby, she didn't know how it's done, because that's what she was exposed to. So even though at that time it was looked at as a freedom, and I'm giving my child this freedom and so on, eventually that translated into, like, what do I do with my child now? I this is how I've been raised, so I don't know how to make that better. So that is one example of how culture can really play a role in this parental trauma.
That is so like different to know, because like where we come from, there's always like, you can't do this or you cannot do this, you do this when you're older or when you're married. So hearing it from a different perspective, where a person's given so much freedom and then they are also stuck, it's my first time actually hearing this, because I've heard of people giving lots of freedom, but it's mainly around my age, and many people of my age are not yet married, or they are not in such a different situation. So for me, it's like I've just seen people like, you do this once you're married, or you do this once you are older, or once you have someone with you, and you can't
Mm.
wait for someone. So that's one of the things many people in South Asian community face, and many people are even breaking through those stigmas that are created. So now when you're breaking through those stigmas, right, you face a lot of backlash. People, families, communities, relatives, they all just come eating behind you and being like, why did you do this? Why are you doing this? This is not how a society works. So when we're breaking through this stigma, breaking through this trauma mainly, we face a lot of backlash. So what should we do as children? Should we like just focus on ourselves and be like, our parents will come along or around it, or should we like help them also slowly change their mindset, but make sure we don't succumb to what they have taught us and learn to change it? Like, where do we find that middle ground? Because it gets very confusing and very hard.
Yeah,
Like, you yourself are like, I am like, I am causing pain to my family members, but I know I need to do this because it's going to help me and I'm not carrying it forward. So it's very difficult. So how do we navigate through that?
that's a very, very good point. And I have personally been through it, because of, like I said, this transition, as our, like, let's say, millennials, this generation was really the last who experience non-technology, right? Like I say, and it's difficult because imagine as a as a mom, all your life you've been raised in a certain way, and then suddenly it comes all these different applications and platforms and websites and chats applications, and your child is you're exposed to danger. You have applications now that are literally like children die, right? They play very dangerous games, and they eventually it leads to death. And it's difficult for parents, specifically older ones who are of course not so familiar with technology and so on, who don't know how to act. Like, do I ban this child from using a phone, or do I take it away, or do I give specific certain like timings and so on? So it's difficult. But to answer your question, I think definitely trying to come to a certain compromise is always the best, because also if you have a parent who is generally parents will try to protect you, right? It's not for the purpose of making your life difficult, it's to protect you. So the idea is, if you recognize that, as opposed to being a teenager when you always think like, oh, my parents, they make my life hell and I hate them and this and that. But actually when you get older, you realize that was just for your own benefit, right? So the idea is, the more mature you get, obviously the closer you get to your parents, and you can then compromise. So you actually have a very important role in helping your parents and understanding this transition and change that has happened in the world. Like, I know, for example, with my mom, I sit with her and I say, this is what's happening, in the social media, this is what's happening in Instagram, this is how TikTok works. And this is so that she is still exposed. She understands where all these new behaviors are coming from. Because now, for example, let's say if she's like my nephew and my niece, or her grandchildren, for example, she now understands why they're doing what they're doing, or like where their behaviors are coming from, or their attitudes and so on, because she's now exposed to more social media. For example, she is now more exposed to like understanding different trends and what, and all of these things happening. So of course, helping our parents understand that this is a very important point and factor, something that is going to get those generations closer. Because if you just say, no, it's my life and you don't understand, this is your generation, they're never going to understand, you're never going to be happy. So you're not, it's not going to get anywhere. So I always say, meet halfway, you know and also, I don't I'm not with, going against your parents in general, but if this is something that's going to harm you, or affect you negatively, then you need to do it, right? So let's say they're against you traveling because, they're worried and so on. You want to travel because you want to go get a degree in another country, which is something that's going to really empower you and affect your future and so on. You need to come to that, understanding. You need to reach to that, like, okay, I understand that you are worried. And this makes such a big difference, as opposed to, you never want me to do, you never want me to do what I want to do. You never let me live my life. There's a very big difference in how you approach it. Because if a parent comes and says, I don't want you traveling to the US alone and living there for 3 years, of course that comes from love and care. So if you approach it in a way that's like, I understand that this is coming from that aspect of love and care, but let me explain my perspective, as opposed to having those constant fight that happen as a, yeah, well, you know how it is. I don't, you don't, you don't want me to do what I want to do, and you never let me live my life. And we come from pretty similar backgrounds and cultures, so we both understand that kind of fight that happened between parents and children that age, or not even children, young adults, I would say, like, who go off to college and university and so on. So the idea is just kind of meeting halfway, compromising, and making your parent also understand your perspective is very, very important.
So I think remaining patient is very key when you're dealing with such scenarios, because I think getting hyper will not help the situation, because then might even like transcribe into disrespect, which I think both parties don't want to do. It just happens because you feel like that other person's not getting or understanding what you're trying to say.
Yeah,
So
absolutely, absolutely.
when we're talking about like these scenarios or like other scenarios of parenting trauma, how does it impact a child's emotional and psychological development?
So can you explain what you mean exactly? You mean like in terms of the trauma, like how it affects the
Yeah,
development of the child?
so for example, like the father and the grandfather example that I gave. So the silent treatment that the father is giving to his son. So what impact does that silent treatment have on the child? Like how does affect the development of the child?
Mm-hmm. Well, it has so many side effects, right? Or has so many impacts, and it comes in different forms. So it can come in the form of like low self-esteem, because the thing is, I'm not talking specifically about silent treatment, but in general,
Yeah.
any negative kind of, approach to your child or any negative kind of interaction, it really leaves a mark. And a lot of parents, especially who I would really go back to in a bit discriminating here, but I will say that, the older generation do not understand that as well as the younger generation, because now like I said, we are more exposed, we are more educated, we're more aware. We now know a lot of things that we didn't know back in like 50, 60 years ago. So the idea is that if I am able to understand that damage or impact, I'm probably not going to do it. But because, like I said, that generational trauma has been transferred from generation to generation, I'm not going to understand that this is actually so harmful. And one of the things that can happen is low self-esteem, and not just low self-esteem, but also low self-worth. And already that on its own is such a big issue. That's not a small issue. I can count 10 or 20, different impacts, but I'm going to stick to this one only because if you have low self-esteem, ultimately in life, you will not reach to your full potential, and you will not be able to really speak out, and you will not be able to say what you really feel and think, which is ultimately then going to go back to your mental health, and then potentially develop mental health illnesses, but also physical illnesses. So just looking at that little aspect of it, like low self-esteem, that has such a big impact on the child. We have so many different impacts. So it always, of course, goes back to your self-image, right? So it's not specifically like it won't impact you, of course, like growth-wise or motor skills and so on, but it will impact your mental well-being. And mental well-being is much more important than anything else. It's the key because we know that scientifically speaking, if you have mental health issues, you are very likely to develop physical illnesses. Okay, a lot of actual very difficult and dangerous diseases, they come from they are they're rooted in stress and mental health issues. So if you have a child and you give that specific, like I'll give my example again. Oh, but you only got an 80, you didn't get 100, or your brother got 100, especially comparison, that is so toxic. Your brother got this, your sister got that. And this is so toxic because it also develops a sense of hate to your siblings, or not necessarily hate, but kind of like resistance, like sort of like well, is he better than me? I'm doing all of these things. So in a way, it not only damages the child, but also the relationship between siblings.
Yeah,
So there's many, of course, difficult things to go through in life because of that little one thing, that,
on
yes.
behavior. But like this was like, for example, a behavior a father did with the child. What if between spouses, like the child sees his parents unable to handle a life challenge. They see that they are flustered, they're stressed, they're panicking, they don't know how to navigate the challenges, or they can't make decisions on their own. Decisions are made for them. So that also, has an impact. Like then children also become dependent on their parents to make decisions. They don't make decisions on their own. And when you grow older as an adult, when you have to move out, or do you want to move out, what subject do you want to study, children cannot make those decisions because they've never made anything themselves. So how does that also affect children's upbringing, or do they also carry on that forward? How do people understand that this is also not healthy?
This is also going back to this like overprotection, and you don't really give your child much of independence. And if you do that, like one very, very classic generational trauma comes from, oh, my father is an engineer, so I'm going to be an engineer. Or, my dad is a doctor, so I'm going to be a doctor. This is generational trauma in a sense, because you're just really pushing your child to become what you are. You're not giving your child space or, independence. You're not giving them the choice to choose what they want to do. I actually had a student in one of the open house I was at recently, and I asked him, "Why do you want to do psychology?" And he said, "Because my dad wants me to do psychology." And I was shocked with that answer. I was like, so you're gonna base the rest of your whole life based on what your dad wants. And a lot of children, they mix that up with, there's a very thin line between independence and disrespect, because a lot of children, they will say, I don't want to disrespect my parents wish or desire or so on. And the idea is that this is not disrespect, this is disrespect to yourself, because you are putting everything you want on the side. And the thing is that if parents do not actually push children to take your own decisions, make your own kind of path in life, this is we can definitely link this back to generational trauma, because this is where it comes from. Their parents had the same, and then their parents had the same. So the issue is that once we break free and we say, you know what, I'm a doctor, but I want you to choose whatever you want to be. You know, I want you to choose literally whatever you want to do, Where's your passions? And that goes back to self-confidence as well that I mentioned earlier. If the child doesn't have enough self-confidence, they will not speak up. They will not say what they want. And ultimately, again, it will reflect really negatively on their mental health and eventually like physical health. So the idea is that we need to give our children space. We need to give them decision-making decisions. Even as very, very young children, let's say a 2-year-old. Now you're going to ask me, how can a 2-year-old take a decision, right? Um, I'm not going to ask them what do you want to be when you grow up, of course. But even saying something like, do you want to wear the red t-shirt or the white t-shirt? This is already decision making. Do you want the cookie or do you want the chips? So the idea here is you give them decisions, because from a young age, when they make decisions, they are capable then to make decisions as they grow older. Independence, decision making is so important, because if they don't have that, again, they'll be stuck in that cycle of being dependent on someone. I've never taken decisions in my life, so how am I going to do it now?
So how do like people at that stage realize that, oh, now I have to make my decisions? How do we like tell our parents, tell our parents, give us space?
Well, it always goes back to education, obviously, and awareness, right? So, like I said, the older generation, like the generation before the millennials, is usually the one who is more affected by that, because again, they have been exposed to that with their parents. So the idea is that if we have enough awareness, we understand the impact. Now, lots of these social media campaigns and I don't know what, and here and there, they're coming up with all these different impacts on your child when you do this and that. Even like attachment styles, for example, this is becoming very popular now on social media, like how your attachment style to your child will impact them in the long term, how they develop relationships with others, how they choose their life, and so on. So the idea is that with awareness, of course, comes change. So we need to put in more awareness. I don't think, to be honest, we have this issue with the later generations. It's still there, of course, because again, it's generational trauma. We inherited from our parents, but it's not as severe, I would say. But the idea is that we need to still it needs to be there. That awareness needs to be there. We still need to put in a lot of effort to change that.
So just to wrap it up, are there any specific interventions that can help individuals heal from parenting trauma so they can become better parents?
Well, there is no such intervention for generational trauma, if you want to put it that way. But there are many different ways, right? We can do it. Like one very good, I love this intervention, which is CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. It focuses a lot on your thoughts, right? Your inner, like kind of like thoughts, and where are those root thoughts coming from? Where is it coming from? And when you are aware, like I said earlier, you have developed self-awareness, you can now work on that, because nothing will ever be changed as long as we are not aware of our problems. If I have a cold, but I think I'm fine, it's not a cold, I'm never going to go to the doctor. I'm never going to do anything to change it. So the idea is that if I'm aware, and a lot of these CBT approaches, therapy, even psychodynamics, a lot, they focus on childhood trauma and so on. And going through like psychodynamic like sessions, psychoanalysis and so on, you can really kind of reveal like what was happening in my childhood. I assume that it's a good thing, or this is the normal, but it's really not, right? And I want to wrap up by saying I'm not generalizing this to everyone, because a lot of people had great childhoods, and even if you had a great childhood, there will of course be mistakes from our parents. They're human in the end. But the idea is that if it becomes to the level of becomes toxic, it really has a really negative effect on your development and upbringing. This is when we really need to put a stop to it and change.
Okay, I saw this quote, and I'm going to end with this quote. We do not choose this identity or these struggles, but we can choose to liberate ourselves. So I feel like that was the main topic or the main key takeaway I would like to take from this session. So thank you, Dr. Alia. Thank you for your input and your advices and for your examples. I think everyone can relate to it. Even I could relate to it, and I've heard that from so many people as well. So thank you so much. And for our audiences, if you have any feedbacks or if you have any questions about this topic, do come forward. Let us know. Reach us out on our socials, and we would love to answer you guys. Thank you so much. Bye, Dr.
Thank
Ali.
you so much, Joa. Bye bye.